you're not going to have saturation of these deleterious mutations throughout the genome. There are mechanisms to counteract that.
No, because if you have all of those mutations per generation, right, the per generation neutral mutation, which is high, if that same amount are being fixed every generation in a population that's at fixation equilibrium, that's a lot of damage being stuck in place. No?
Well, I feel like we're going in circles here because, like I was saying, you're saying, again, the mutation rate equals the fixation rate. I'm saying that's not what's occurring even for neutral mutations. And this goes back to, again, depending on the effective population size of the organism, of the species.
No, I have an excerpt from a paper here. Okay. I don't know if we got time to get into it. I have it in front of me. And it says that 4NE still applies even regardless of the population size. I mean, do you disagree with this citation in front of me from this textbook from Douglas?
Do you have a quote for that specifically, or?
Well, I have this quote
for
right
what
here.
You just said.
Yeah, I'll have to get that citation after. I don't have a slide on it or anything. I have it.
Or could you just read it real quick? Or
let me find it. I had it saved in my phone. Okay.
I'm just curious what it says.
For sake of argument, if it's not affected by population size, okay, which is the case, I assure you, but you don't have to believe me if you don't want to. How does that I don't know. I'm just kind of flabbergasted. Like right here is what Fatuma is saying. You're disagreeing with it?
Well, I'm not disagreeing with it. I'm just saying it can't be applied to all cases.
But Fatuma said, okay, it can't apply to all cases. Elaborate on that.
Well, just like I said, it's an approximation. It works for certain. Well, like of course, mutation rates differ for different organisms. So obviously, the molecular clock is going to differ as well. But also, like going back to what I was saying is I'm just curious what you have that says that the effective population size wouldn't affect this, because in my mind and according to my understanding, it would.
So it's from a textbook. I have a photo of it right here because, as you know, whoa, earthquake from TRock. Thanks, brother. Okay, welcome, gentlemen.
I guess what I'm trying to understand is, it seems like you're saying there are certain mutations that are kind of always neutral, so they're going to fixation due to this mechanism.
Listen,
and what I'm saying,
I got the screenshot. Wait, Andrew, I got the screen. You got to give me time, man.
Okay.
I got the screenshot from the textbook. As I told you, Christopher Roop and I wrote that highly technical article there on this issue. And so it says, since on average, it will take 4NE generations for such mutations to reach fixation, about the same number of neutral mutations should be fixed in every generation. The rate of fixation of mutations is theoretically constant and equals the neutral mutation rate. This is the theoretical basis of the molecular clock, but it continues. This is the part I didn't have. Notice that, surprisingly, the rate of substitution does not depend on the population size. Each mutation drifts toward fixation more slowly if the population is large, but this is compensated for by the greater number of mutations that arise. So, I mean, that's in the same section that I showed to you from this Fatuma.
Okay, I think I see what he's saying there. Yeah.
See right here?
I guess I'd have to look into the context of that. Yeah, because I understand what he's saying there. I'd have to think about that.
I'd like to say something on that, if I may.
Yeah, you know, it sounds counterintuitive to a lot of people, and it's definitely not the case if humans only go back 4,500 years. There's no time for all of that substitution. There's not a time. There's no time to reach a fixation equilibrium. But the point is, most mutations are deleterious. Most mutations are neutral. but they are slightly deleterious. They just don't have a better example could be, and Paul Price uses this example, Andrew. And so tell me what you think about it. If, let's say I got a mutation that decreased my ability to breathe effectively every generation. Okay. Well, at first, my ability to intake oxygen and my ability to just breathe, respiration. Okay. At first, it's not going to affect reproduction. I'm still going to be able to have lots of kids, but eventually, that mutation will be passed on. It'll spread enough to where the ability to respirate effectively will decrease. Total functionality will decrease, even though reproductive fitness has stayed the same. So you have reproductive fitness staying the same. It's stable. But total functionality is slowly going down. Okay, so here's total functionality slowly going down. Reproductive fitness is the same. But eventually it reaches a point where total functionality has gone down so much, and pretend this is reproductive fitness. Now reproductive fitness starts going down, and they're both going down together like a ticking time bomb. Okay. And fixation equilibrium makes the problem worse because it's like a ratchet where it gets worse and worse and worse, more and more damage accumulates. And what happens is you reach a point where total functionality has been decreased so much that there is no increasing total fitness. Total fitness always goes down, even if reproductive fitness can be stable for a while. Speak to that. Tell me if that makes sense. Go ahead.
So I just have to question how you could demonstrate that premise that the breathing would somehow not affect reproductive fitness. And the other thing that I would like to clarify is, so what you're talking about seems to be more of a population kind of crash at the very end. Like it reaches a certain point and then the population declines dramatically. But that doesn't sound like what you're talking about with genetic entropy in terms of these mutations accumulating and the fitness declining at this what you're saying, a time bomb, basically. Like that, those seem to be kind of separate from one another. Does that make sense?
Well, it's any mutation with a low. What does this mean to you? A mutation having a low selection coefficient.
Well, that means it has a low impact on reproductive fitness.
A low impact on reproductive fitness. And so what does that mean then?
So it means
that
you have fewer offspring than the average.
It's going to get passed on. Right. Okay. So it's going to get passed on. But it doesn't mean that mutation is not also slightly deleterious. In ineffective respiration, think of it like asthma. People with asthma, it's more difficult for them to breathe effectively, but they can still have a lot of kids. But if we take the analogy,
right, but on average, if you're saying it has some deleterious effect, on average, they will have fewer kids than the rest of the population. Otherwise, it wouldn't be deleterious.
I was going to push back on this, if I may.
Go ahead. And
yeah, no, go ahead, Donnie.
And before you do, Carlos, I just want a TRock and jungle jargon.
Yeah, of course. No problem. Of course.
I was going to shut it down at the 4-hour mark. It's almost the 5-hour mark. So what I'm going to do, I've been going nonstop for 5 hours, but since TRock is here, and TRock, he knows a thing or two about a thing or two. And so we're going to let you guys go at it for a bit because I got to get some food and drink in me. Okay. So if I've been hogging the mic for a while, this is your chance, guys, for everybody to get in on it. Go ahead, Andrew. What were you saying?
Oh, I was just saying I'm going to have to take off too anyway. It's getting late where I live, but
okay.
What was I going
to? If you wanted to engage, if you wanted to engage TRock for a few minutes, I know TRock was saying that he missed you, Andrew. Because Andrew, you're a well-rounded evolutionist, and we love engaging people who are well-rounded because it makes it more fun. And if I keep doing these 5-hour open mics, forsaking the gym, I'm going to become very well-rounded horizontally here. So, gentlemen, I'm taking a quick break. This has been an excellent genetic entropy showdown. Carlos,
Yeah, thanks.
go ahead. I know you wanted to push back, and I got
So-
faith in TRock to answer your objections. Go ahead.
So my pushback is one. I think it's one thing to say that the rate at which fixed mutations will occur is constant. I think it's a different thing to say that the same applies to the rate
Carlos?
at which any given.
I got to
can you hear
say,
me?
yeah,
Am
it's.
I coming
I
in
don't know
weird?
why it's. Have you done anything differently? Because for the majority of the time, your audio was great. It was loud. It
It's
was
really low.
bounding.
Yeah,
now we-
yeah. I'm not sure too much. Let me know. Yeah, how do I sound right now?
Seems
Are
like
you
we're
on
both
your
having
phone?
some
Different?
tech issues.
Yeah.
I
All
think-
right. So you know what? I think I'll wrap it up here for now then. And
Actually,
I'll
Carlos,
catch
you
guys
do
next
sound
time.
a little better. Carl, you do sound a
Yep.
little better. I pumped up your volume, and so
Okay.
yeah, go ahead. You're good.
It might be also because I'm trying to be a little bit quieter because it is kind of like it's approaching 1 o'clock in my area. So one thing I want to say is that it's one thing to say that the rate at which fixation may occur is constant. It's another thing to say the rate at which any given mutation becoming more deleterious is constant. So in your example of asthma, I think that was a good one because I was going to bring up something like that. It's one thing to say that, I'm saying that, asthma is going to affect you a little bit, and then the next generation, they're going to have worse asthma. That's a whole different thing than saying, the population overall is going to get more mutations. However, the real pushback that I have is, while you can say that initially, while it was slightly deleterious and had no impact on reproduction, it is not necessarily the case that as it continues to decline and become slightly more deleterious, that it will stay having no impact on reproduction. So, for example, we see this with people all the time. If you have really bad asthma, yeah, you can have a lot of kids, but socially, we're going to look at you like, no, we probably don't want our future kids to do this. We do this all the time. I ask myself, do I want to have children with somebody that has cancer or somebody that has leukemia or can pass on whatever to my offspring. So in that regard, I would push back and say that if it would get to a point, I was going to ask you my question earlier, clarifying on does this only apply to things that we can't see? Because if it applies to things that we can see, mutations that we would be able to see, at some point we're going to say, okay, we're probably not going to breed with those people. That person's literally going to have a harder time socially breeding. Even in other animals, we see things where there are like slight outcasts because the animals notice there's something slightly different about this animal, about this member of my species. And so that would be my pushback onto that. Like if this person has a lot of trouble breathing right now, but it's not that bad. But I'm saying, if compare that to somebody else that literally is on a respirator, at that point, probably he's not going to have somebody that's going to want to breed with him. It's my pushback.
To my understanding, it's not just deleterious to physical attributes. It would be deleterious to other physiological processes as well, if I'm understanding it correctly.
Yeah, because he made the example earlier also of the lifespan. Well, that's why I had that question of if it was only about things that we couldn't see or things that weren't physical like that. But that's why I have that subsequent pushback of it's not the case that every time the subsequent generation becomes more deleterious that we can say it's has an equal low impact on reproduction, because that may not be the case. If we look at it, I'm saying, if your lifespan is deteriorating to a point where the population isn't going to get past that point, it's going to happen that the people that are still living with that are probably going to notice. I'm saying the species might notice, or if not, that portion of the species will die off, and the rest of the species will continue.
I'm not sure if he was saying that as the mutation reaches fixate, or as it goes to fixation, the overall health declines as well. I understand what you're saying. I'm trying to figure out if that's what he's saying, or if he's saying the mutations are accumulating one after another after each one reaches fixation. I kind of see the point you're making. The other,
it seemed
the last, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, it seemed to me what he was saying was that like so it's hard because I don't know what he would think would be a good example. But let's say we have a certain mutation, and that mutation is only slightly deleterious. It has a low impact on your ability to reproduce, right? But the next one, and let's assume that one also becomes fixated because it's part of the situation. That one becomes fixated. So then the next generation, we have to assume one that mutation got even more deleterious, which may not be the case for this generation. And two, we have to assume that specific mutation is also going to be one of the fixated ones, which also may not be the case. And so
that's actually a good point. Yeah.
If we do that, then we are also led to this situation where if we assume both of those things, so then we can keep going to the point of, hey, so the next generation is going to be worse than the last one. But what's going to happen is at some point, we have to assume that every member, just because it's fixated, that doesn't mean, again, that every member is expressing it. So we'd have to assume that every member is expressing it in order for the entire population to die out. Otherwise, what's going to happen is we have one section of the population that is expressing it and is dying out, and another section that isn't expressing it and dying out. And they will notice this most likely if they have a certain degree of intelligence. And if they don't, well, then there may be some measure of counterbalance between those two mixing in. And in humans, this is why I was saying specifically with humans, we're so intelligent, we circumvent a lot of these issues just in the way that we socially interact with each other. Eugenics played a part in this, and eugenics is horrible, but that obviously played some part in it. You know what I'm saying? People were saying there, I don't want to reproduce with somebody that has these traits or has this sickness. So that's going to circumnavigate a pretty big part of that issue.
Right, and that also brings to mind.
Hey guys, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to jump in. Are any creationists engaging you guys in your points?
No, I think we're actually having a back and forth on what you were talking about, which is kind of weird.
I thought somebody was going to jump in and debate for me, but if I got to address arguments,
it seems like we're actually trying to argue on which version of this you're on. So I guess we need your input on who's closer.
So, Carlos, I apologize. I don't know you very well, Carlos.
Yeah, no problem. I'm new, man.
I was sitting here listening, trying to figure out which side of the fence you're on, because I just don't know you, and I was just
evolution.
Okay, so does that mean we have two evolutionists and the rest are creationists?
I believe so.
Okay. I mean, I would be glad to engage some of the points. I was just kind of listening to follow along where you guys were in the conversation, but
oh, no worries. I was upstairs getting some food ready, and I just could hear. I felt like it was just Carlos and Andrew.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but the general gist of this whole line of conversation has to do with genetic entropy, right?
Yep.
Specifically genetic entropy. So I was listening earlier, a couple hours ago. I was outside working on my trailer, but I was listening to quite a bit of the conversation, especially while Luca was still in the live stream. And so I'll be honest with you, I heard some really bad arguments, but one of them was I heard somebody say something to the effect that, and I don't want to misrepresent anybody, but it really sounded like what they were saying was classical thermodynamics, second law. The second law of thermodynamics has nothing to do with genetics.
No, so what I was saying was that the second law of thermodynamics has nothing to do with the way entropy is used in the term genetic entropy. So genetic entropy refers to, from my understanding, the accumulation of slightly deleterious mutations, which apparently, as you guys are saying, become fixated over time.
I guess, okay. So, I mean, that's great for the clarification. Thank you. Because I guess I couldn't take issue one way or the other, but I think I would agree with you by and large that when most people say genetic entropy, they're not really talking about the second law of thermodynamics.
Yeah, they're not really talking about entropy at all. I would say, of course, entropy happens with every process. That's just by one definition of entropy. that is just what happens. You know what I'm saying? We lose quote information. I don't want to get bogged down on what that means because people misunderstand that as well. But yeah, it's just I thought it was funny that they use the term entropy, but completely give it a different definition because it has nothing to do with entropy.
That's a fair observation. I think by and large I would agree with that. That most of them really don't have second law of thermodynamics in mind when they're talking about it. However, having said that, I mean, I'm sure you're aware. I'm a creationist. Genetic entropy is a real problem for evolution, and it's specifically because the second law of thermodynamics absolutely does apply to biological processes.
How would you correlate genetic entropy itself, though, as it's defined with the second law of thermodynamics in itself? Because those are two different issues. You know what I'm saying? In terms of let me ask you first. What's your rundown of entropy?
I mean, in a real simple sense, entropy just refers to the randomization of matter and energy in the world. That basically the all processes have a tendency towards disorder. Basically, that's the simple definition. I know there's
that's generally the layman's understanding. Yes.
I mean, I know there's some nuances, and this is my exact problem with arguing against entropy and actual second law of thermodynamics entropy in biological processes, is because in classical thermodynamics there are a lot of nuances about closed systems and isolated systems and blah blah blah,
Right.
and so you have to go chase all these rabbit trails down. But the reality is that biological systems are open systems, right? I think you
yes.
I think you would agree with that.
Yeah.
But one of the really bad arguments that I've heard evolutionists make, so it's pretty common, you'll hear people say, well, abiogenesis can't happen because of the second law of thermodynamics, and the classic response
that's a horrible statement.
I disagree with that, but I'll tell you the classical response from the evolutionist is that, well, that's true in closed systems, but the Earth is an open system, right?
Yeah, generally yes, but if I may, finish your point.
So the whole point there then is that in entropy, when you are talking about functional entropy that you can observe and test and demonstrate, the more open a system is, the faster entropy happens. You have to close up and disallow all of the incorrect types of energy into the system in order to reduce entropy. And Earth being an open system is exactly why things like abiogenesis cannot happen, because the Earth is too open. There's too much random energy allowed into the processes.
So when you say it's a matter of disorder and you're talking about energy, can you elaborate on what your notion and understanding of that is with regards to how entropy, like I really want to understand what you know about entropy, like as scientific as you can give me.
So I mean, entropy, when you're talking about entropy, you are talking about randomness. You're talking about generally, so you got to keep in mind, I come from a mechanical engineering background. I do not have a graduate degree at all in mechanical engineering, but that is...
I don't have any degree, bro. Don't worry about it, man. As long as you're not pretending to be somebody that has a degree, I don't have a problem, you know?
I'm not making any big claims about that, but I do come from a mechanical engineering background. And my only point there is that in mechanical engineering, you have to actually be able to apply the principles. If you can't apply them, then they're just purely fantasy as far as we're concerned, because there's nothing you can do with them.
Granted, but would you acknowledge that there are differences in the way that different mathematical branches apply certain notions?
Sure.
Okay, so it is likely the case that however it's applied in mechanical engineering is much different than how it's applied in quantum mechanics. This is a common issue that people have when you have people that are math scholars it's a common joke that math scholars hate the way that physicists do math because they do a lot of things contrary to how regular people do math because there's certain other things that they have to take account for.
I mean,
So,
honestly, I wouldn't bother arguing that point at all. I would just
well,
say,
no,
okay.
I actually want to hone in on the whole point of randomness.
Well,
So
yeah,
the issue with the randomness is, what does that mean to you? What does the randomness mean to you?
so basically, in any given system, a certain amount of energy is just lost to heat. In other words, it's energy that dissipates away in a form that you can't use, and it can't be captured and reused in a meaningful way. So in mechanical engineering, what they teach you about entropy is that the hypothetically most efficient engine possible is one that has infinite heat reservoir and essentially zero heat on the cold side, so that there's an infinite difference between the hot and cold side of the engine. Right? So and they say that because they're and we're talking about the hypothetical side of entropy, not the practical side. In the hypothetical side, what you want to do is take the heat that is not used for useful energy, recapture it, bring it back into the system, and convert it back to useful energy, and just keep that cycle going. Well, here's the problem with that in the real world. In biology, living organisms have a very low operating temperature, and the delta T, it's super low, but it's the most efficient machine that anybody knows of in the world, period. So the thinking in classical thermodynamics is clearly wrong.
I would have to disagree because so if we're looking at it from the notion of how organisms operate, um, first off, so going back to the notion of randomness, and you were pretty spot on, in terms of energy being pretty much just lost, and there's no way to really get it back. So you move your arm, you've used energy, you can't get that energy back. But again, we are not closed systems. We're in an open system, and we can. At the end of the day, the real issue that would be debated is whether or not the universe or cosmos, depending on whether or not you make a distinction there, is an open or closed system, which we don't have proof for one way or the other. So the thing here is it's a non-problem because we're not a closed system. The Earth is not a closed system. We get energy from the sun. That energy goes into other things that we consume and whatnot. So it's just a complete cycle of energy. Yes, we will at some point. It's likely that at some point there will be an end of that energy cycle, and we'll have an eventual heat death. But saying that there's a heat death isn't really a problem in and of itself. It's just kind of pointing out an observation of what is to occur.
But in genetics, you have to maintain the order of genetics, and that's the problem with genetic entropy, is that you can't maintain the order that it had.
Well, Carlos,
that's not a problem. Well, hold on. If I can respond to that real quick, that's not really a problem because that's just the second version of entropy, which is just saying that there's no way to tell there's very little way to tell what situations occurred to get a certain outcome. Like if all you know is that I added two numbers together to get the number 8, there's no way. This is the other version of entropy. There's no way for you to tell me how I got 8. I could have added any series of those numbers.
We know what cancer is. We know that's genetic. The order is being lost.
That's just entropy in itself, though. That's not really a problem. That's a different version of genetic entropy because you're not actually talking about things being lost. Really, when you're talking about genetic entropy, you're talking about the accumulation of slightly deleterious mutations that become fixated. No, that's a big difference. The loss of information and the accumulation of deleterious information are two different things. Those are not the same thing in the slightest.
So, Carlos, let me bring it full circle for you real quick. But one of the things that I think you failed to acknowledge is that what I said early on, the more open a system is, the
Mhm.
faster entropy occurs. And so when
Mhm.
when you apply that to genetics, particularly abiogenesis, granted, but when you apply that to first life on Earth, having this broad open system in genetics, your DNA is actually made up of a whole bunch of very weak hydrogen bonds, chemically speaking. And so having the wrong kind of energy present at all is extremely detrimental to the process. And so the easy way the average person can identify what I'm saying is that when an animal dies on the side of the road, it decomposes very rapidly, specifically because of how weak the bonds are and how little energy it takes to tear them apart. So having a wide open system absolutely does nothing to further the argument that
Well, my question here though to that is, what is the actual issue that would propose? Because you can say that yes, those things may deteriorate slightly faster, but they're with regards to fossilization, there's different that has nothing to do with the sedimentation, because there's certain rates, different rates at which certain things will fossilize certain structures. So my question is really, what is the issue here that as you're applying it to the open system losing more energy faster? Because it really just seems to me like you're just pointing out that, hey, at the end of this, the energy is going to run out really quickly, which isn't.
No, that's not what I'm saying at all.
I understand that's not, because I'm just saying that's what it sounds like to me, and I want to be corrected on what you're saying.
I'm trying to bring, like I said, I'm trying to bring this full circle to how it applies to genetic entropy.
Okay, go ahead.
And I'm starting with abiogenesis only because that's the common usage point for the second law of thermodynamics argument from the creationist side. And the typical response from the evolutionist side is, well, it's an open system. And I'm saying, well, the creationist is actually right, because having the system too open is problematic for entropy. It doesn't solve anything. But when you extend it to genetic entropy, so you ask the question, how is it that I perceive entropy in general? And I'm talking about heat and how it randomizes processes and randomizes matter. So specifically, heat, what it does is it excites the motion of atoms, right? And subatomic particles. That's what heat is by definition. So if it excites the motion of molecules, and you think about like a deer going to the lake to get a drink, you got to think about a couple different things. Number one is that I mentioned that biological systems are the highest efficiency machines that anybody knows of, but they're still not 100% efficient. So
right, because nothing can be, as far as we know.
Exactly, that would be what we would call a perpetual motion machine, right? So,
unless the order was maintained. If the order was maintained, they would keep on going forever.
Well, right, and so this is the point. If it's less than 100%, that means you're losing some of the energy to random heat loss. And so if you take your own body operating temperature at 98.6 degrees, you find out, of course, that is a relatively substantial amount of heat, and a whole lot of your body energy is just randomizing into the atmosphere, and you can't do anything about it. You can't do anything with that heat that's lost.
Yeah, granted.
But when you bring it down to the molecular level and how it relates to DNA, you've got the same problem whenever you're doing reproduction, cellular division, any of that kind of stuff. You've got the same problem. It's less than 100%. It's losing some of its energy to, to the atmosphere. Can't get it back. And there's another element to the whole randomness point of entropy, and that is, talk about the deer going to drink out of the lake. What's in the water that the deer is drinking? And where I'm going with this is, mistakes happen. You guys talk about mutations. You talk about mutations. You talk about natural selection, but you never really get to the root cause of what drives mutations. And what I'm saying is, when that deer goes to the lake to get a drink, what's in that water is exactly what drives mutations. He's not drinking H2O. He's drinking H2O plus, some fine particulates of mud. There may be a little arsenic. There may be a little bit of manganese. There may be a little bit of just about anything in that.
Somebody might have let it go in the ocean. Had it,
Sure. Absolutely. I mean, go swim in a river and pay real close attention to what's floating by. And so the point then is that when you take that stuff into your system that's less than 100% efficient, those random molecules or those random atoms of lead, arsenic, whatever it is that's really not good for you, they get into your cells in mass. And your body has a way to mitigate some of the damage, but it can't mitigate all of the damage. So what I'm saying is mutations happen because of the randomness of the chemistry in the environment. And as long as that's true, genetic entropy has to be true. And you can extend that to the mathematical distribution of where will the mutations happen. In people, you got 23 pairs of chromosomes. Your mutation.
Hold on, you kind of lost me with the because you jump from randomness of energy to the randomness of what's in the thing, which is not, again, you're delineating from what entropy at that point would be talking about to bring in this random matter, because entropy is just a matter of the randomness of where the energy is going to go. So when you're bringing in these other forms of matter, it's not really much of an issue here. I guess my big problem is, how are you tying this into this randomness of energy and heat to the accumulation of deleterious mutations?
Well, one is ordered heat, the other one is ordered information.
So, yeah, the way you tie them together is that you can't just talk about entropy like it's just energy. Energy is only energy if mass is involved, because that's what.
You were bringing out the other. So you were bringing up the other version where it was like, we also don't know what was in the water that they had. Okay. Well, so the loss of information. Got you.
My whole point is that random energy moves random matter.
Mm-hmm.
That's the whole point, is that random energy moves random matter. They're not separable in any way. The basic energy equation is 1/2 mv squared. Mass is in there. So you can't have energy without mass. And the only way to have mass without energy is to have it at 0K. And so the lake example is that you've got random energy, you've got meteors striking the earth, you've got lightning storms, you've got whatever kind of energy input, tornadoes and thunderstorms and whatever you want, earthquakes, volcanoes, you've got all this random energy. And so what's in the lake is a product of random energy. So all of that, it's indelibly tied together. You can't separate the two like they're two different things.
Okay, but even if I grant that, what's the actual issue here? Because as far as I'm not really saying it really is just kind of just again making just kind of explaining what entropy is at that point. You're not explaining how how that correlates with us accumulating more negative, more deleterious things, and then saying that it breaks the second law of thermodynamics.
No, what I'm saying is I did tie it together. What I said was that once you understand that the randomness of energy randomizes matter, and that the chemistry of your environment is the product of that randomized energy and matter, you're taking things into your body that are not conducive to anything but a process of accumulating mutations, period. I mean, we don't drink pond water like the deer do. But if you go get a chemistry report on your water supply at your house, you find out that you still got that problem. Your very well filtered H2O is not really just H2O, even in your house. And so the whole point, though, then, is that the distribution of that random chemistry in your genome, it's inescapable. You've got 23 pairs of chromosomes. Which chromosome gets a mutation? Because you guys talk about this mutation rate, which is completely bogus, by the way. You talk about a mutation rate that happens one mutation per person per generation. That is purely hypothetical. In reality, you've got over 3 billion base pairs. And whenever you take food into your body, if the chemistry is random in your food supply, all 3 billion of your base pairs of DNA are potentially affected by that chemistry. And so what I'm saying is there are actually a lot more mutations per person per generation. It's just that there's no good way to quantify what it is. And so as long as you do a simple mathematical distribution of random mutations in all 23 of your chromosomes, you can have an alleged beneficial mutation in any position in your genome, but it doesn't negate the fact that you still accumulated deleterious ones in other places that get passed along and accumulate.
Okay, but then I think the problem here, first off, maybe I'm going to have to look more into how things are done in mechanical engineering. But
I mean, it's
as far as that goes, I would say it's, first off, it's much easier to tell what's deleterious than it is to tell what's beneficial. Because a big point that you're missing, that a lot of you tend to miss, is that what's beneficial depends mainly on circumstance involved. It's easy to say, hey, this is deleterious, because those are more easy to see the impacts of. It's way easier to see that something is negatively impacting something, as opposed to deciding whether or not something is beneficially impacting can pretty much, from our standards, be rather subjective, because you can say, I don't think this is beneficial, but I can say, I think this is beneficial. But we can both agree that something is deleterious because it objectively negatively affects what's going on. It's causing harm or disorder to the structure. Whether or not we think two different types of order are beneficial is more or less subjective, or based on the circumstance at hand. Okay. So again, this is why we harp so hard on the fact of fur, because you guys tend to just ignore it, which is, if you say, we could say that an organism gains fur to protect them from the cold, like, you know what I'm saying, like if fur occurs throughout these reproductions, that's beneficial if they're in an environment where fur keeps them warm. If they're in an environment where fur makes them hotter, it's not beneficial. But that's easier to see, because, well, how much fur, what temperature is going on, how much fur does this one individual have, what's the proper amount of fur to keep them warm, that's all open variables, as opposed to whether or not this fur is overheating them. That's not as subjectively defined. It's way more of an objective thing to see.
So I'm the first one to say that number one, I'm not sure how delved in you are to the creationist viewpoint, but there are creationists that will absolutely deny beneficial mutations exist. I am not one of the.
I like to give everybody their chance to explain if I put them in a box like that, because obviously there's so many variation. Even among atheists, I hate when people try to put them in a box. It's a term, like theist is just a term saying you believe in God. You know what I'm saying? Nothing else to it. I don't know anything else about your position.
I just want to point out that I'm not one to argue against beneficial mutations. The fact that they exist is to me perfectly normal. There's nothing wrong with that. But there are creationists who will argue against them. I'm just pointing out I'm not that one. I'm happy.
See, my problem here is that I'm wondering. Oh no, I've got echo. Is that me or somebody else? I'm hearing echo.
I was just gonna ask if you can give an example of that, or give an example of, say, fur coming into a species that didn't originally have some kind of fur, where there was added information, not the loss of information. Because you guys like to use dogs and wolves as an example. Well, with the wolf being the common ancestry, you can find all the genetic traits from our common dogs in a wolf. You can see where it's all loss of information.
Well, like I said earlier, personally, I don't have genetic information like that, because I don't really delve too heavy into biology.
Well, you guys are talking about the beneficial mutations.
Well, I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example of something we can actually probably test, right? So if we take a species of dog, right? Let's say we have I'm not a breeder, but let's say we take a dog that's all white, right? Is being all white beneficial or deleterious?
It's this was one of the points I was trying to make earlier. I'm one of the first ones to tell you that, and I'm not alone by any means, but I am more than happy to tell you that the idea of beneficial mutations or deleterious, for that matter, can be highly or generally are highly contextual,
Yeah, yeah, I agree.
which exactly makes your point.
Well,
Is that
although I would say with the caveat that again, deleterious ones are slightly less contextual. Have a tendency to be slightly less contextual than beneficial ones,
a little
only
more
because it's
absolute, right?
easy. Because deleterious pretty much depends on whether or not it's detrimental and or killing you or some way or making life harder
Well,
for you, which is
uh,
easy to see. You know what I'm saying? Like, I
understood, but let me take it a step further on beneficial mutations, because in your example is white fur beneficial or deleterious. Well, okay, if you're in the Arctic, it's obviously beneficial, but
exactly.
it's only beneficial while you're in the Arctic. As soon as you leave,
Granted,
that exact same thing becomes not necessarily so beneficial, right? And could
granted.
actually be quote unquote deleterious or harmful, in the sense that, you know, now all of a sudden you're a very visible prey to a wily predator. So anyway, all of that.
Granted, I agree.
Quick gut check on what I was talking about the randomness of chemistry, how
Hmm.
the random distribution of mutations in your food.
Chemistry also now one of my things.
Okay.
I'm trying to work on getting my math up. No, don't let that deter you, because I
uh,
would like to get more into these subjects. Obviously,
uh,
I would like to learn more about these subjects and my
Understood,
own
but
time.
I'm going to make a real easy point that anybody can follow, and that's
Yeah.
exactly that's exactly why we do this in mechanical engineering. But real simple gut check: when you take an aspirin,
Mhm.
how long does it take for the chemistry in that aspirin to diffuse into your body?
It had to be aspirin. I don't know. I'm allergic to aspirin. I
You get the
I would
point
say
though.
probably about an let's say an hour and a half, maybe I don't know. They say
30
don't take,
minutes,
what is it, 30
30
minutes? I
minutes
don't
to
know.
an
I've never
hour
taken an
maybe.
hour. I
It's
haven't
been a
taken
long.
medicine in so long.
It's
Well, you get the point though. Whenever
Yeah,
you
I get
take
the point.
medicine, it basically has to diffuse through your body fairly quickly. And
Hmm.
so what you're saying then, what is the chemistry of the aspirin? And when it diffuses into your body, because and I use this example because aspirin is actually taken in a lot of cases to relieve a headache, for example. But you can also have body aches, general body aches in your joints and stuff like that. If you have a flu, for example, you might take aspirin to help reduce your fever, eliminate a headache, and eliminate body aches. So the point there then is that aspirin has to diffuse through your entire body, and it's affecting, specifically, it's getting into your cells. If it's not getting into your cells, it cannot resolve a problem with your headache.
Hmm.
And so that's all done, of course, because your body is so much liquid. If it's so much liquid, put it all together. Your body is a high percentage of liquid. The chemistry of your food supply diffuses through your body very rapidly. Your internal efficiency, ATP synthase efficiency, is less than 100%. All of that spells the same thing, and the randomness of the chemistry of your environment, it all spells the same thing. The distribution of copying mistakes during cell division is a direct product of the randomness of the chemistry. Therefore, the distribution has to, number one, it cannot be a single mutation in 3 billion base pairs. It can't be. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever, unless you're talking the hypothetical deep time required for fixation over certain size populations. But
I think that's generally what we're on my team is generally we're giving
sure.
that time. And I'm gonna let you continue, and I'll mute my mic so you can continue your thought. But I just do want to say I like to give pushback when people say time, because I don't understand why people give so much pushback on time as if, but we'll go back later. Go ahead.
The real point there is about what's proposed to be a very slow mutation rate with fixation, when in
Oh, okay.
reality, you, the aspirin example is very fitting, because the chemistry goes through every cell in your body practically in minutes to an hour or so. It's really quick. Every cell in your body is affected. That means if you take an aspirin and then cell division happens afterward, the cell division has to be chemically speaking, the cell division has to have been influenced in some way by the aspirin, right? And this is exactly why pregnant women are advised not to take certain types of medication, because your cells can recover from it. I will grant that, but the real point is that the chemistry distribution, the mutation distribution, it's across the entire genome. It's not one mutation out of 3 billion base pairs. It has to be logically much more than that.
Well, to that, I would say it is not the case that the way we are currently is the way that organisms were. So it could be the case that they just simply circumnavigated those certain issues just off the lack of being, off the principle of being less, for lack of better terms, complex systems.
Do you recognize the loss of function that we have in our genomes?
How do you mean? I would say I could say we have loss of function in the genome, but I don't see how, if they're not really affecting reproduction, it's much of a problem. Even if you stack them, if they're not affecting reproduction, it really doesn't matter. Going back to what I said before, if it is the case that there are things that we can see, well, generally populations are going to avoid that. If there are things that we can't see, well, it's not the case that the entirety of the population is going to express that what you say, that detriment in functionality.
But it's the loss of function that causes us
that loss in function
to die, right? We die because of loss of function in our genome. You know that, right?
That's what you guys are saying. Yeah, that's fine.
No, that we lose the ends of the telomeres and all.
Oh yeah, the ends of the telomeres. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
why people are trying to do things with telomere extension. That one dude I was just reading about. One real rich dude. He was trying to do some kind of telomere infusion.
There's all kinds of people looking into it with all kinds of supplements and everything, which I take too. I'm 65 years old, but I take.
This is probably the one of the few things I did try to look into with genetics. I did watch I think it was a few videos on telomeres and centromeres, but again, I only paid but so much attention. But that was one thing I do remember they were talking about. As the telomere. Well, because here's the thing: as the telomeres shorten, yeah, we die. But if they don't ever shorten, then we get cancer. So.
Well, I mean, if everything's working properly, you're not going to get cancer, and there are remedies for cancer too, with natural intake, natural foods.
But at the point that they're no longer deleterious to the point where they don't impact reproduction, at that point, they're not an issue of really genetic entropy right there, because then you're not talking about a mutation that is as defined by genetic entropy, which would be a mutation that is slightly deleterious but doesn't impact reproduction. Unless you want to say they're generally mutations that don't impact reproduction, but that's the only way you can do that, is if they generally don't. But then you'd have to allow generalities for things like what we propose.
So you have deleterious. So you have deleterious things happen to your genome after you reproduce, but not before.
I'm not sure.
That's a great point, Jungle. That's a great point. It's always happening. I had a debate here a while back with the Dr. Chris Thompson.
Yeah,
and he basically was trying to make an argument along the lines of what Jungle is suggesting. He was basically saying, well, okay, the chemistry only affects reproduction at the time of reproduction, and that's a horrible argument, especially from a guy with a PhD, because the chemistry that's in your body. I mean, you think about anybody who's ever had to take a drug test. How many months in advance do you have to get off of drugs to be able to pass the most advanced drug tests?
No, because I think what he's saying then at that point would be that it only matters with regards to the point of reproduction, because if the mutation happens after I reproduced, well, that doesn't matter because I didn't pass it on, unless I reproduce again while I have the mutation. If I reproduce prior to having that mutation, then it doesn't matter. It could be the case that all these mutations are being fixed, but it's not the case that they're all being passed on, because people have children at different times in their lives.
The whole
Some people,
point,
some people don't make it to have kids after they have, it could be the case that I have a kid, then I have the mutation, then I die. That mutation never gets passed on.
no, that completely misses the point. Your Jungle's point is that you're developing mutations from the time you're conceived all the way up till the time you're able to reproduce. You're accumulating mutations that entire time.
That's fine, but the only ones that matter are the ones that I pass on. Anything I don't pass on doesn't matter.
That's exactly the point. Those are the ones you're going to pass on. You're going to pass on 50%, and your mate is going to pass on 50% of their accumulated mutations. And what's the net result? Basically 100% of however you want to quantify it, but numerically.
But it's not the case. But it's not the case
you have, or the exact same amount your partner has, plus additional ones that happen because of the reproduction process.
But it's not the case that, like, we can say that a person is going to have X amount of mutations over their lifetime, X amount of deleterious mutations over their lifetime, but it's not the case that all those mutations are going to happen prior to reproduction. Yeah, I'll grant that. I can grant that we have a few of them before the person reproduces. I may have, let's say if the number's 50, I may have 25 of them before I reproduce. It's not the case I'm gonna have all 50 before I reproduce. I could have 5. I could have only 3 go on before I reproduce.
We inherit all kinds of genetic deformations.
Yeah.
The only point you actually have there, though, is that yes, you do continue to accumulate mutations in your genome as you age, and you don't pass all of those on. That's true enough, but the problem is still that you passed on 50% of what you did have at the time of reproduction. Your partner passed on 50% of theirs. You added a couple more because of the reproduction process, and the net result is more accumulation. So it's irrelevant that you kept on accumulating mutations in yourself that you never passed on. That's not even part of the point. It's a simple mathematical distribution. If you've got 23 chromosomes, pairs of chromosomes, and 3 billion base pairs of nucleotides, your distribution by necessity of mutations has to be random, and there's no way to select them out.
I understand that the ones I'm inheriting the one I inherited are being passed on, but what I'm pointing out is that the ones I gained during my lifetime that aren't inherited, the ones that are random that I gained that I'm going to pass on to my children, are not necessarily a lump sum like the argument proposes. You can say that mathematically there's a set number of this, that happens every generation, but we know that circumstantially it is not the case that is going to be exactly what happens.
No, that's not the argument. The argument is just simply that between the time you're conceived and the time you reproduce, number one, at conception, you inherited mutations.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, you accumulated a minimum additional one mutation because of the reproduction process. Number three, you added additional mutations through cell division while you were maturing to sexual reproduction. Now, if you inherited some that you keep, you added some during the reproduction process that you keep, and you accumulated more before you got to reproduction maturity that you keep, and then you pass that on, that's the argument. That's it. It doesn't matter what happens after reproduction. I've already acknowledged that. It's irrelevant. The point is, you never started out with 0 mutations. You inherited additional mutations that weren't in your parent population, and you contributed more before you got to reproduction.
Okay, and that's fine, because you already acknowledged that what is beneficial or deleterious is impacted by circumstance. So even if we're gaining deleterious mutations, The problem is that you're not seeing here is that the circumstances can be such that those deleterious ones are actually now beneficial, especially being again with it's not like every animal is fucking stupid. Oh, sorry for the cursing. It's not like every animal is stupid. I need
But
some
it's
water.
I get yours.
Especially with humans, you know what I'm saying? So it's like we have, especially with humans, we have a tendency to take things that are we consider weaknesses and try to turn those into benefits or problems of some sort. Handicapped people do this all the time. Which are, or people that have, certain other disabilities. They do that all the time. I have this issue, and so I've learned to use it to my advantage. And so we organisms can take some degree of agency to depending on the organism. I would say I wouldn't assume every organism has the same degree of agency to do that, but they can be in situations where now they can make that deleterious thing beneficial.
it doesn't mean it's a good thing, though. I mean, that they're trying to say it's an advantage when it could be in certain ways, but in other ways, it's not an advantage.
Well,
So
no, yeah, nobody's saying that. Again, we're not saying they're inherently one way or the other. So that's the thing. If we were
Carlos,
saying they were inherently one way or the other, then yes, but we're not. We're saying that it's dependent on the circumstance. So
No,
if it's
but if
dependent
it's
on the circumstance, then you can't really just, aside from something that's actively causing, straight up harm to somebody's
but,
structure or lifespan, in a
but
quite clear
since
way. If the situation puts them such that they can turn that into now something that's beneficial, by definition it's not deleterious
so
anymore.
but
Carlos, I was listening earlier a couple hours ago while you were basically making the same general argument that people with their intelligence have a way to mitigate the effects of otherwise deleterious mutations, right? That's what you were arguing earlier, and you're kind of reiterating that same point.
Yeah.
And so that is actually not a terribly uncommon thing for evolutionists to argue, except there's a massive problem with that line of reasoning, and that is that in the evolutionary timeline, people have only been as intelligent as we are for a handful of thousands of years, and the mutation rates that they propose for macroevolution are so slow that handful of thousands of years is completely irrelevant.
No, that's fine, because I already acknowledged that different organisms have different degrees of capacity with regards
But
to how much they can mitigate certain circumstances.
But all that aside, there's another problem, because kind of what you're alluding to is basically how most of them would argue about selection. So selection pressure will do this, selection pressure will remove the deleterious, so on and so forth. And so back to your point about how contextualized beneficial mutations are. Well, here's the problem though. In this whole grand scheme of evolution, you have this very piecewise process of developing things, an extremely piecewise process. But it's a piecewise process literally at the molecular level, while what I was describing earlier, below the molecular level, at the atomic level, your chemistry is randomized, and your body is composed largely of weak hydrogen bonds. That's why they tell you don't eat lead paint and stuff like that, because that chemistry jacks up your health really quick and mutates your cells really quickly. And so the point then is that piecewise processes combined with really weak hydrogen bonds that are disrupted very easily by what you might even consider relatively benign chemistry, like too much salt in your diet or too much sugar in your diet, disrupts your body chemistry. You can't piecewise anything together over time. In other words, the majority of evolutionists, almost always what they're doing is hand waving away the real mechanics of the chemistry that has to happen, and just saying, oh, natural selection, oh, environmental pressures, oh, we got these magical solutions that basically say none of that is really a problem, when in everyday life it's absolutely a problem.
I disagree because if you're saying you're hinging heavily on the fact that it's all randomized, which again I would say you're hand waving away the intelligence because you'd say in your example of like the horse, you're talking about a horse drinking random water. We don't do that. Okay, we've built societies, and going back to our intelligence, we've built societies where we pretty much regulate the way we do things. Yeah, there's going to be some degree of randomness with maybe something gets into the water system in your area, so and so. But for the most part, we try very hard to make sure that we meet certain standards to make sure things go a certain way with what we're consuming. People have their own
That's
agency to allow certain
irrelevant.
to not make certain choices. No, it's completely relevant because
It's still relevant
he's saying that it's completely random when it's not.
to
Because
genetics.
if the entire population is focused on making sure that the things that they consume are as clean as free of diseases, as free of bacteria as they can be, then you're limiting the degree of randomness that you would otherwise have in an area where you don't have the technology to mitigate that degree of
We
randomness.
we
Again,
know
so if you have
there's
a if, so if,
we already know there's populations that have more genetic mistakes than others. We already know that, and it's
yes,
basically
and that's
because of the health
probably because of
standards,
lack of technologies.
because
Again,
of the
because they
health
don't have technologies to mitigate
standards,
those certain
but
things.
it doesn't eliminate the mutations.
Because
Unless you're
it's not supposed to eliminate the mutation. They don't have the technologies to eliminate the mutation. So of course the mutations are going to arise. We do. You notice that in those areas
It
that
doesn't,
have those don't have as many issues, they are highly
but
technological as
we
opposed to places that don't.
but we can't eliminate our mutations. That's just
Why
silly
would
to suggest that we eliminated all 100% of our
why would we want
deleterious
to
mutations.
eliminate all that? That's
You
eugenics.
would want to, but to claim that you have,
Not
that's
necessarily
foolish
that's
on your
eugenics
part.
because again that's eugenics because if we can say if we want to but then we have no real capacity to determine what is going to happen in the future with regards to what we've created as an outcome. If we got rid of those mutations,
No,
it could be the case that something else
you're
happens to us
you're
that we
not.
couldn't account for.
You would be naive to think you're getting rid of the 100% of all deleterious mutations.
I agree because why would you want to? You would cause a big eugenics problem.
Yeah, but you're assuming that mistakes are good, and
No, I'm
the
saying that
mistakes are the
circumstances can
problem.
cause I'm saying that circumstances can allow for mistakes to be good,
But
which should not be debatable. And
yeah, but
and we even agreed. What was your? I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name.
but
Was TRock?
Well,
genetically
Maddie.
speaking,
Carlos, how can you say it should not be debatable when you can't give an example of a good mutation, a beneficial mutation?
Because we not agree? Do you not agree that an organism that is white that has white fur that evolved to have white fur, it has a beneficial mutation by having white fur if they're in the Arctic as opposed to being somewhere like
right,
uh
right.
uh what's it called, an
But can you
Amazon.
prove that it's white because of a mutation or
You're
because of its
forgetting
loss of information
you're
through?
forgetting the entire construction of the hair or a feather or a scale requires genetic information
No, I'm
to
not
make
forgetting
those.
that. It's already put into the fact that there's small changes. If the problem is you're trying to leap from
But
one
No,
state to another.
no,
you
I
can't
just like to show.
assume that the mistakes made a scale, made a feather, made a hair. It's genetic information that is ordered that made a hair, a scale, and a feather.
Yes, when it all accumulates in the same way that a wheel alone isn't a car and a bolt alone isn't a car. But if you have a wheel, a bolt, and several components, you eventually get a car. You can't just have a car with one piece. But you have all these pieces that exist prior to a car existing. You can make a car.
But those are all intelligently designed pieces.
That's not the point.
You can't have you.
The point is
No.
that I could.
No, that is the point. You cannot show me a
No, the point. It's
beneficial
not the point. The
mutation.
point is that
You
the point
cannot
was
show me
that
a
no,
species.
no.
No,
Hold
let me
on,
talk. You've been talking all night. Let me talk. So
Matt.
you
You're
cannot show
misrepresenting
me.
my point.
Well, let me make my point.
Okay, go
So
ahead.
you cannot show me a beneficial. So you cannot show me a beneficial mutation of where something did not exist in a creature, say a creature that had no hair, where it got hair. Now, a white hair, yes, it is beneficial, but was that there because our creator put it there? Or can you show me where the beneficial mutation created that hair or created anywhere along like the hair follicle or anything along that way? You know, without that, I mean, that's a we want evidence, not
Again,
theories.
you
What you're
you could
presenting is theories.
me personally, I don't have the exact data for that specifically. I'm sure you could probably find it if you want, or something relatively close. But again, the point that I was making was more so that the point you're making essentially a fallacy of division. You're saying that the parts of the whole have to have the attributes of the whole. They don't. These things can have their individual parts. These individual things can coalesce to be one thing that has the whole thing.
That's what you
It's not the
believe.
case that one thing, when you say this organism goes to another organism having hair, that's not what happens. It's an organism that goes to an organism that has something that slightly resembles hair follicles, then an organism that goes to something that has something else that
Just
slightly more
believe.
resembles hair follicles, and starts producing keratin or whatever to produce hair, and so on and so on until we get to
Jungle,
organisms that actually
somebody's
have
got an
hair.
echo.
So show me that. Show me any of that along the way. Any evidence of that.
I'm sure you
I
could
mean, you're
search it.
saying that everything came from one cell, but you're saying all the parts were there. So no, you either have one cell or you have all the
It
parts.
came from one cell, but it's not the case that that one cell was the original cell.
So one of the big problems that I
That's
think
why I even brought up the whole mitochondrial Adam and Eve thing in the first place, because it's not the case. We have a mitochondrial Adam. We have a guy that we can trace our lineage to all the way back, but it's not one Y chromosome in Adam. It's not one single guy. It's one guy that can potentially change as the genome shifts and as people die off. That can change to now we can only trace it back to this other guy. And it's the same thing with the cell. We have a cell that we started, but not necessarily that one cell.
But you know the reason why we can trace ancestries like that is because of mistakes in the genome, in the Y chromosome that are being made.
Yes, but funnily enough, you accept genetics for everything except what goes against your position.
Carlos,
if we've been
I think
around
one of the
millions of years, that there would be a lot more mistakes.
So, Carlos, I think one of the big things you're missing in this whole discussion, and I can appreciate the fact I'm not a geneticist either, and I know you're not.
I'm sure I am missing a few things.
Listen real close, though. Listen real close to the arguments and how they're put forth. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I was completely duped by the bait and switch that evolutionists do for a long time, and it was only very recently that I was able to kind of sort it out with the help of an evolutionist, nonetheless.
Okay, hold on real quick, because I don't think you're going to forget this point. Are you in control of what's on the screen?
Yeah. Donnie's doing that.
Well, Carlos, I wanted to...
Okay, no, go ahead. Sorry. My bad.
No, that's okay. There's a couple things I wanted to address that I've heard in the last 30-ish minutes of discussion. One thing about fixation, but let's deal with the most recent comment you made about mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Noah.
This Noah thing is new to me. That sounds pretty interesting.
Well, we say Y chromosome Noah because the last universal Y chromosomal ancestor of all men today would be Noah, because we had a flood bottleneck, right?
So the previous one was Adam.
Yeah, and then from Noah to Adam. But chances are the Y chromosome of Noah and Adam wouldn't have been all that much different. And so I still think it's accurate to say Y chromosome Adam as well, because it really is just a single Y chromosome that we have on the planet, because every single male Y chromosome, again, is nearly the same. But I want to focus on the mitochondrial DNA.
I was gonna say real quick. From what I recall, don't we have two mitochondrial Eves? Like we not two, but we found there. It is the case that we have a secondary one.
Well, we have So, for example, this is a
A
mitochondrial.
successor.
Yeah, we've got a mitochondrial phylogeny here. So this is worldwide mitochondrial DNA diversity. And we've got haplogroups. So for example, this is the HVR haplogroup, most common in Europe. Okay, so this represents people groups. It represents people worldwide. Now, you'll notice all these branches go back to a center point, and from that center point you have explosive growth. It's like this starburst explosion, right? And
Yeah, I
what
was
that
wondering what
tells
kind
us,
of graph this is.
yeah, it's an unrooted phylogenetic tree. It gives us a natural representation of real mitochondrial DNA diversity. So anyways, my point is, and a counter to what you're saying, we have evidence here of one woman from whom we've all descended from. Mitochondrial DNA, and this is where I want to go to this paper and get your thoughts. This is a paper, it's from the conventional literature. It's called Mitochondrial Diversity Within Modern Human Populations, okay? And so they've actually discovered Eve. It's called the Eve consensus sequence. And I'll interpret this for you. They're basically saying that the mitochondrial DNA, it's mostly invariant. And so what that means is most of it's the same worldwide. There's only a few, it's about 25 to 30 DNA differences separating any two people in the mitochondrial genome. This is what this means, okay? And on average, so notice this. The 827 sequences within the data set contained 2,631 variant positions, and on average differed from the consensus by only about 21 nucleotides. That means any two people, they only differ by about 21 differences. Okay, so what they did is they looked at the rare deviants worldwide, okay, where we do differ and where we don't have the same nucleotide. And they were able to come up with what's called an Eve consensus sequence, as in we know what Eve's mitochondrial genome looked like. And so where you said that this Eve would have had previous ancestors or she would have existed within a population, Carlos, I appreciate the point, but it's just false. That's not what we all we have is data that suggests we've all originated from a single woman in the not so distant past. And so how can you look at this data and extrapolate it to mean that this woman existed in a larger population and had previous ancestors? Where do you get that from?
Can you I'm sorry, can you run down one more time how this how this states that she was not from a population?
Okay, so I'll use an illustration. Let's say I handed out 100 different 100 of the same manuscript. So I handed it to 100.
Hold on.
So no problem.
Hold on. My phone's dying. Oh no, I forgot.
I think he just got. Oh, is he still there? His phone probably just died.
He's still there.
But he may join or he may not. I'm not sure. We're at the 6-hour mark. So I'll just wrap up my point for anybody interested. So basically, you've got a manuscript. Okay. One manuscript. Let's say you have 100 of it. It's all the same. You hand it out to 100 different people and you say, I want each person to copy the manuscript. Well, each copy then is going to be a little different because nobody's going to copy it the same. Everyone's going to make mistakes and everyone's going to make unique mistakes. Well, how do we figure out what the original manuscript was? Well, it's easy. We take all the copies and we can easily find where all the deviants are, where all the mistakes are. We can find the unique spots as well. And we can remove those from the equation. And when we do so, what do we have? Well, we're back to the original manuscript. And so that's what they did with mitochondrial DNA, is they were able to take mitochondrial DNA worldwide. They were able to find the rare deviants, remove those from the equation. And what we're left with is Eve's mitochondrial DNA sequence, the literal sequence of Eve in terms of the mitochondrial DNA. And so, no, that doesn't go back any further than that. That's the original manuscript, is essentially my point. Anyways, gentlemen, if you had any thoughts on that, maybe Carlos will want to join. But before we shut it down, to be fair, Jungle Jargon, you didn't
Yeah.
have enough time to ask TRock a question in our last open mic on the fossil record. And so maybe this was predestined to happen, where now you have the opportunity to ask
there you go.
TRock that question. Did you want to do that before we wrap things up, Jungle Jargon?
Sure, if TRock is up for it.
Sure.
Yeah. I started before trying to ask a question, but my question was whether or not you've heard the evidence or seen the evidence for a breakup of the continents after the global flood, and it didn't seem like you understood or knew what I was trying to ask.
No, that's a fair point. I really I didn't quite get the gist of what you were asking, but you were I guess were asking, was I aware of specific physical evidence in the world that the breakup happened after the flood?
Yeah.
So to be honest with you, no, I'm not really familiar with any particular evidence anybody's put forth that it happened after the flood. I've heard some of the arguments, but mostly it's centered around what the Bible says about the days of Peleg and so forth. But as far as actual physical evidence, no. But I would be glad if you could kind of share some of that.
Right, because you were addressing geology and you're an engineer, and so I was thinking you should know or understand some of this, but like you said, you never heard of any evidence. And to be honest, I haven't heard any evidence from creationists either very much, other than what the Bible says that in the days of the Peleg, the earth was divided and people began to speak their own languages.
So
But
did you have specific physical evidence that you wanted to talk about?
yeah, there's, like I said in the last time, there's a lot of evidence to support it. One of which would be the sediment layers themselves, which line up, as well as the fossil evidence. The fossils in the sediment layers line up between the continents as well. Are you aware of that?
Sure. Yeah, there's basically both the sedimentary and the fossil distribution that spans across continents that are no longer connected. Yes.
So then the question would be how, if the sediments were deposited in the global flood, and how would you have a breakup if the breakup was before the sediments were deposited? How would the sediment layers be lining up between the continents along with the fossils?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It really is, and that's one of the difficulties in working out the specific mechanisms and some of what I was trying to put forth in my proposed model. That there are some nuances like that are really difficult to nail down, and so I've personally kind of gone back and forth on the whole continent splitting up before or before the end of the flood, at the very end, or post flood. I'll say very generically that the continents were probably still had a fair degree of quote unquote rapid motion after the 371 days that the Bible describes. Take that for what you want, because you could put that time anywhere in there. Go ahead.
So then you think the breakup was a continuation of the global flood?
Yes, I absolutely, because it's continuing to this day. I mean, that's why you have so
Right.
many evolutionists that want to harp on this idea of plate tectonics and mountain ranges lifting up and so forth. And the way I describe it is that
So
what
then it
you
would
see
have to.
today, is residual motion of the original continental sprint.
Okay, so the 5 or 6 mega sequences were deposited in the global flood and then they broke up?
Well, no, that's a great point, because that absolutely does appear to be per exactly what you identified. If you've got this sedimentary and fossil distribution, it's the sedimentary distribution to me that makes the real point. But they're kind of tied together, so it's okay to say it either way. But
Well,
because they do span across no longer connected continents, that pretty much tells you that the sediments were laid down first and then the continents broke up.
yeah,
Now,
that's what it seems like it would be the case. And there's another line of evidence too. Are you familiar with the glacial striations in India that go from south to north?
no, I got to think about that for a minute. Glacial striations in India. So what you're saying is, for example, you have a very large glacier and it's got a lot of debris in its underside, and it's basically made drag marks across the continent at some point.
Yes. But this is a point that evolutionists or people that believe in deep time would bring up the fact that there's glacial striations. And had a little bit of a discussion with AI, and I said that the striations are on top of the sediments in India going south to north, and the AI corrected me and said, no, it's on top of the bedrock.
Well, okay, so no, that's an interesting point, but I don't know. Do you spend very much time on CMI's website?
I'm sorry, I'll be back. My phone died. So I want to go back and listen to what Donnie said, so he doesn't have to backtrack. I'll be back later.
So, Jungle,
I do. I mean, I listen to their videos. Yeah. In
okay,
fact,
so do
I
you
listen
read
to
any
just
of their?
about everything. I listen to just about anything and everything from
You,
any creation mystery, as long as it's young Earth and not too
but do
boring.
you read any of their articles?
Um, well, I'm trying to get to the evidence of
Okay, well,
the.
no, that's fine. That's fine. I only want to point that out because they're a good source to help you with this idea of the glacial striations in India. So I'm not trying to comment one way or the other that I think they are or aren't this, because like I've already said, I'm not really familiar with them. But CMI points out in some of their technical articles, or even if they're popular level layman articles, they point this out that argument from evolutionists about glaciation and the striation. I can't remember what they call that, but anyway, that's a common argument, but it's loaded with a major fallacy in that you can actually get that exact same thing from basically uprooted trees that drag debris with them, like rocks and dirt and stuff like that. And so it's really hard to distinguish whether it's literally from a glacier or
Well,
whether it's from vegetation, dragging
yeah,
root systems. When an entire tree root system gets pulled up, it can absolutely pick up rocks and stuff with it and do the same thing that a glacier will do.
yeah. Well, regardless, it's pretty well known what's glacial markings and stuff and deposits, but it would have the problem in India. It would have to be some kind of movement that came up out of the ocean and went north in India. That's
Yeah.
just not going to happen.
I mean, like I said, I don't think I could comment one way or the other. What I think it is, I'm just really saying that beware of some of those evolutionary arguments, because they're not necessarily rooted in a complete picture of how processes actually play out.
Yeah. So the complete picture is that it's not just India, it's South America,
Right,
it's Africa, it's Australia,
right,
and India, which were all connected to the South Pole, Antarctica,
right.
and they all have glacial striations going from south to north from when they were still connected to Antarctica after the global flood, on top of the sediments and fossils that were deposited first, and then
Yeah, so that conversation kind of approaches the idea of where's the post flood boundary, right?
no,
It
it
sort
has
it
nothing to
does.
do. Oh, the post flood. Oh, the post flood boundary. Yeah.
Well, the point being that if it's,
Well,
it sounds like what you're kind of saying is that perhaps the continents broke up after the flood, and you had an ice age, you built up a bunch of glaciation, and now you have some geological evidence left behind. In other words, if you see these glacial striations, it's a post-flood process, right?
Yeah, without getting too complicated, it's probably post flood.
Right, and
Generally
that was
speaking.
my only point. If it's post flood, that means that that probably, and what you said, it's right on top of what looks like obvious flood
The,
sediments,
the
right?
bedrock. It's right on top of the bedrock,
Yeah.
which is what AI said the glacial
Okay.
striations are.
I would be really careful with what you get out of AI, though. Really, really
Right,
careful.
but it was just funny to me because I was trying to convince it of a whole bunch of things. One of them being the breakup of the continents, and it corrected me.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I'm not
but
saying it
but the
wasn't correct.
correction was funny because I didn't mean that the striations are on top of soil or sediment that's not from the global flood, that or
Right,
erosion. I meant the stuff that was there after the global flood,
right.
not accumulations on top of it.
You just have to know that AI is actually trained to tell you more popular opinion than it
Oh
is
yeah,
fact.
I'm aware. I'm aware of that. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
that's
So,
and I actually convinced AI of a bunch of things, but that's a side note.
yeah. So
But
back to your original question about how, you perceive when the continents broke up. So AIG and guys like Andrew Snelling and some of those guys argue very strongly against post-flood continental uh, split, and they're like extremely adamant about it. But the majority of their reasoning has to do with 2 points. One, that the biblical text is really just referring to a division in language, not a physical division of the earth. That's the one prong of their argument. The other prong is that they think that it would literally kill everybody
yeah,
that was alive post
right,
flood if that happened.
r-
I
right.
don't think that's a very good argument
But
myself.
the thing is like I wanted to mention before when you're talking about it, it's not so much how it happened; it's just evidence that it did happen,
Right.
and
Okay.
then the how that it happened could be explained if you investigate or look into it
Sure.
because
I will tell you now. Again, I'm not trying to have. I just don't have a firm opinion on whether the continental breakup happened post flood or not, except to say that there is one very plausible reason why it started before the flood ended, and yet you still have the sedimentary distribution that you talked about, and that is that in the process of the flood, because it is a full 1 year plus time span, you've got deposition only happens for a percentage of that time anyway. And then after deposition, you're pretty much at the end of the what they call the inundation phase. And now you're in the recessive stage where the waters are receding back off the continents. So the point then is that you can lay all of the sediments in the first, we'll say, 5 months. That's the 150-day time frame given in the Bible. Um, if you lay all the sediments in the first 5 months and then split the continents after that, you still get the same look.
yeah, but they seem to want to use the split up as being the mechanism for the global flood, for the deep fountains of the deep breaking up. But
Well,
another
you got to
problem is
separate those two, though. You got to separate those two. The mechanism. Well, and to be perfectly clear, whenever I was giving my presentation, I was basically disagreeing with aspects of every one of the popular models, but agreeing with some aspects of every single one of them, is essentially. And so, if you're talking about the CPT model, for example, they believe that the accelerated nuclear decay started plate subduction, which I strongly disagree with. It's not even physically, it's not even a viable model at all. How people with PhDs in anything would sign off on that is honestly beyond me. I just don't get it. But so what they're talking about started the deal. You are correct in that sense. They want to say that accelerated radiometric decay started the splitting process and caused the flood to ensue afterwards. So that in that model, you're correct. But if you look at the hydroplate theory, Walt Brown's, again, I disagree with a lot of what he says in his book, but I do agree with some aspects of it. His is a little different, and this is a point I honestly just do not know about his model, and that is, so he says very much what I was saying. Hydroplate, the hydroplate part of it, I'm agreeing with. What he says triggers it is very different, though. He says lunar tidal pumping basically pressurizes these water chambers under the continents and in the ocean floor, and over time so much pressure is built up that they finally rip apart, and that's what starts the flood. Now if you take that at face value, you would come to the same conclusion. Per your point, he's saying that ripping the continents apart was the beginning of the flood. I'm not saying any of that. And I'm agreeing with the part that the continents set on large water chambers. They ruptured and the continents started moving, but my mechanism is different, and the timing it can be very different depending on exactly how I try and synthesize it all. But what I'm saying is the starting mechanism was either meteorite impacts, which Michael Ord identified, or we just don't know, because the Bible says very specifically in I believe Genesis chapter 6, he says the Lord says, even I do bring a flood. In other words, it was no random happenstance. The Lord did it. He does not tell us what he used. It could have been, if it wasn't the meteorites, then we just don't know. But I'm assuming in my model, it was the meteorite. So the point then, sorry, I'll try and wrap this up real quick. The point then was that if the meteorites impact out in the ocean floor, breaking open water chambers, it starts the process of the fountains of the deep breaking up, but it doesn't necessarily imply that the continents start splitting right away. What I actually suggest in my personal model is that once the fountains break up and you start depressurizing all that water that's under the continents, it takes some time to get that water out, get enough pressure release before the continents actually gravitationally start collapsing and then breaking. So there is, in my model, there is a lag in time. It's not up front at the beginning of the flood.
Okay. In regard to the mechanism, I do see the possibility of a mechanism if you look at the evidence of what happened. For example, the evidence, according to the breakup after, was that all the continents were located at the South Pole, or all the landmass was located at the South Pole, of course, on to one side, and it had to have been because of the glaciers that formed, because the glaciers would have taken 100 years to form after the global flood. They wouldn't have happened right away. I mean, it wouldn't have happened during the flood for sure.
Right. No, that's a good point. And so are you suggesting then that the glaciers existed before the flood began?
No. I'm saying they couldn't have existed before the flood.
Okay.
So they had to have existed after the flood, which means that all the continents were connected at the South Pole to one side of the Earth, like they are still today, except they're more sprayed out. Which, because you're the engineer, right? So you should know about centrifugal force, right?
Sure, and that's a good point.
And you know about cement, right? You know about the guarantee for cement, what it's guaranteed for?
I'm not. No, I mean, I'm not a civil engineer, but go ahead and tell me.
Well, it's basically the same thing. Cement has, people joke, they say it has two guarantees. It's guaranteed against theft and it's guaranteed to crack.
Right.
So what happened as the sediment layers were becoming cement, basically, they began to crack. But that alone might not have been enough. There could have been another cause, like you say, an asteroid or something, which could have been the cause of the global flood to begin with. And like you said, that God caused it to happen. Yes, he did, because God causes everything to happen, whether it was an asteroid, whether it was natural, whether it was physical, whatever. Every aspect of everything is caused at the hand of God. Everything's by God anyways. So when God says he gave people or confused the languages, yes, he confused the languages by way of whatever means. He still confused the languages because everything's by his hand anyway.
Right.
So when you have all this landmass at the South Pole, but not over the South Pole, to one side of the South Pole, and it's the cement, becoming concrete, basically forming rock and cracking. And it could have been another asteroid or something with some of the more evidence, because I'm not even getting into all the evidence yet. But just as far as the cause of the breakup of the continents, could you possibly see that the plates right after the globe, or 100 years after the globe, would have been somewhat still unstable, and suppose that an asteroid came and helped the continents to crack, the sediment layers to crack, and what would have happened in a spinning Earth is the centrifugal force would have caused all of the ones connected to the South Pole, if they broke apart, once they broke apart, which direction they would move would have to be north from the South Pole because of the centrifugal force.
Centrifugal force isn't a real force.
So South America went north from where it was. Africa went north from where it was. Australia went north from where it was. India went north from where it was. And as they went north, of course, they spread apart from each other.
So, yeah, I mean, you talk about centrifugal force. In reality, just to be perfectly honest, you can't really. It's virtually impossible to make a definitive statement of centrifugal force versus. And I'll tell you what my basic explanation is. And so it's not centrifugal force per se, but if I'm following the standard mainstream view on the rotation of the Earth and everything else, and I'm happy to do that. Generally, to your point, what you conclude, this is engineering 101. Literally at the 101 level, you do this, and I've heard creationists argue against the idea of the change in the tilt of the Earth. Some creationists will argue that the tilt was always what it is. Some will argue that there was no significant wobble as a result of the flood. If you follow standard mainstream viewpoint on Earth's spin, you have to conclude that the Earth wobbled and the tilt probably changed. And to your point, centrifugal force did play a part in how the continent split.
It can't, because centrifugal force is not a real force.
That's irrelevant. You understand,
but you understand. No, it's completely irrelevant. You can't say something that doesn't exist.
No,
is plays a part.
argumentative.
It makes no sense.
You're
He
being
might mean
argumentative.
centripetal, but not
Carlos,
centrifugal.
you're being argumentative for the
Centrifugal.
sake of being argumentative.
Centrifugal.
If you're saying centrifugal, then centrifugal force is not a real force.
You're being argumentative for you understand
Yeah.
that the basic concept is
Then
just like
lawnmowers don't
it's
work,
just
okay.
like when you put water in a bucket and spin it around in circles. The water wants to go to the outside. Period. It doesn't matter.
That's just a matter of inertia, but that's not centrifugal force.
It doesn't. Irrelevant. You get the point of the mechanism he's
to the
describing.
conversation.
It's completely irrelevant. How is something that doesn't exist being
Disrupting
is
the
that not irrelevant?
conversation.
Carlos,
disrupting the
you're
conversation.
saying if the Earth is spinning and the continents break apart, nothing is supposed to make the continents follow the rotation momentum.
No, I'm not.
That's all he's describing. If he's using words that don't mean technically what you think they should.
No, it's a big difference. It's a big difference here because centrifugal force would be. He's trying to describe the direction in which these bodies will move based off of the spin. But you're saying centrifugal force is not a real force, so it's not really going to play a part.
That's not relevant.
Carlos, you're a little bit muffled. I'm wondering if there's I can turn up your volume on my end, but could it be your speaker on your phone? Maybe you get a.
But as far as the speed of the Earth, let me check my
Jungle. I will say this though: the one problem with a quote unquote centrifugal force cause in the separation of the continents is that they split away from a common. It's the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. They split away from a common seam point between them, and so if the Earth is spinning from east to west, then they should both move the same direction if it's strictly this centrifugal force idea.
Well, they did go the same direction. They all went north, but
no, that's the problem. Is they didn't go strictly north. The U.S. if you go back when I put this up during that presentation, the Western Hemisphere went northeast.
I know what you're saying. They split apart from each other, and you can see it in the Mid-Atlantic Ridge.
Right, but the Eastern
Northern
Hemisphere
Africa
went northeast.
Was connected to the east coast of the United States,
right?
And Southern Africa was connected to South America.
Right. So the point though is that the Eastern Hemisphere went north to northeast, and the Western Hemisphere went north to northwest. And if it was purely the result of centrifugal force, then they should both go the same direction.
No, they would go north. They all went north. The centrifugal force would cause them to go north. And that's what they all did. They all went north. As they did, they separated from each other, including India and Australia. But Australia broke apart from Asia. Asia just kept on going. And I could get into more of the other evidence, and that's unexplained tsunamis and burials of all kinds of animals in the Arctic and Siberia, and entire ecosystems were buried.
Gentlemen, I think this has been a great back and forth. I think I'm going to start winding it down and try and wrap it up right at the 6.5 hour mark. And so that's in about nine minutes. Hard to believe we've been going 6.5 hours. This has been great. TRock and Jungle Jargon.
I couldn't imagine being in your position and being able to give up 6 hours of my life every week to host this.
I'm just barely.
Hey, these are always a blast. I'm glad TRock and JJ.
This is awesome.
We definitely want you to join more, Carlos. So I guess in the last few minutes here, I did want to make sure, Carlos, that you had a chance to. Have you tested to see why you might be muffled? Because you're coming in great earlier.
I think so far it's my charger. I'm charging my phone, and when I took my charger out, I was coming in clear, and that's when my phone died because I forgot I took my charger out.
That's right. If you're charging it, that's probably what it is.
Like, watch now. How do I sound now? Do I sound any better?
Oh yeah, perfect.
Way better. I just took my charger out. Yep. Science.
Okay. Science. There you go. You figured it out. I'm impressed. You made a testable prediction, and it came true. Now I just hear. an echo from me. So let me see if that's. Is your echo cancellation off?
That might just be a problem with my mic. I'm gonna have to go get a new mic so that to make sure this doesn't happen.
Are you hearing an echo too, TRock?
I hear the echo. It sounds like somebody's got two different screens open with the program on it.
I hear the echo.
Let's see. Is it better now? Well, Carlos muted. Okay. Well, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh no, I think we're good.
Let's do some tests. Let's see if it's me. I'm gonna mute myself now.
No, I think whatever we did fixed it, so I don't hear a mute anymore, which is good.
So I also unplugged and replugged my headphones. So
I guess in a nutshell, and I'll give you the chance to respond, is going back to the Eve argument, and then I'd also like to wrap it up with something you said on fixation. So, Eve, we have our sequence. You would argue, if you were to look at the sequence when we remove all the rare deviants, I'm not sure if you heard my illustration, but if I handed out 10 manuscripts to 10 different people and said, copy this out, each of you. Well, each person that copies it is going to have their own unique mistakes, right? Each copy is not going to be identical. And so we can look through each copy and we can figure out which ones are mistakes, which ones are the rare deviants. We can remove those from the equation and we can get a pretty close approximation to what the original manuscript is. And so they've done that with mitochondrial DNA. And so we have a very good idea into what Eve's mitochondrial DNA sequence looked like. Okay. And so the point is, where do you get the idea that this woman, of whom we've all descended from, belonged to a larger population and even has previous ancestors?
Well, simply just based off of the way that the mitochondrial Eve is defined. Frankly, again, going back to the notion of it being that female ancestor of which we can furthest tie every living person to. And again, with also the notion that can change as people die and other people are born. So it's just simply the case of acknowledge all you're doing really, I would say, is just acknowledging that aspect of the definition, where is that, yeah, there's going to be a point where we no longer can connect everybody that's living past this person. That doesn't mean that there weren't people past this person. So to give you an example, and I'll say, supposing this is the case, I'll just say, let's say perhaps I'm wrong, but so supposing that this is the case, at some point in the future, there should be a point when the furthest we can go back is somebody living today. Does that mean that the person that they can trace it back to today didn't have ancestors? No, it just means that we can't trace back past that person.
Right. But so, for example, here on this mitochondrial phylogeny, the issue that you're going to have is this represents worldwide mitochondrial DNA. So it's not like, well, we're just looking at the HVR haplogroup here and these branches, which represent DNA differences or mutations. They go back to a common ancestor here. So all these people here have a common ancestor that goes back here. But no, we're looking at worldwide mitochondrial DNA, and all haplogroups, meaning all people groups worldwide, European people, Asian people, Australian people, African people, they all go back to a single woman. And to infer that woman had previous ancestors is without justification, because again, we have very little diversity in the mitochondrial DNA. There's only about 25 differences on average separating any two people. Okay. And the mutation rate's fast. It's about 0.5 per generation in the mitochondrial DNA. Do the math. How long does it take to accumulate that much DNA diversity? It's trivial. We could easily get that in a couple hundred generations. How do you take that level of diversity back hundreds of thousands of years, 200,000 years, Carlos?
I personally can't say, because again, I don't delve into that area, but I would just again stress that just because we can't go past that one individual does not mean that there weren't more individuals past that.
But then it
Donnie,
also
Um,
doesn't. Let me say this. But then it also doesn't mean that there are.
Well,
Donnie, can you
no, but it's
clarify
more
for us real
likely.
quick?
That's true. I would grant that, but it's more likely that there are because from what we see, people come about from people.
No,
Donnie,
Right.
can
because
you
no,
Donnie,
guys,
can you
I'm
clarify?
gonna refute this because I've refuted this in my book. Here's the problem: the only way, and this is how evolutionary scientists, and I've debated many, how they explain this is through coalescence. That mathematically, you're just bound to land on a single ancestor of whom we've all descended, right? But the problem is, Carlos, and you can look up coalescence theory. Coalescence relies on a number of assumptions, but one major one is what's called random mating. Okay. But the problem historically is there has not been random mating. What I mean by that is historically, people have existed in tribes, they've been isolated and separated from each other. And so if you have
Yeah, I would
a
agree.
group,
That goes.
right.
Sorry, that kind of ties into my point earlier about what I was saying.
Yeah.
Um,
And so if you
people
have,
are intelligence. Yeah.
yeah, so if you have people, right, I remember you talking about that earlier. So if you have people in Africa and people in Australia, or even within Africa, Africa's massive. Let's say you have a tribe, in this spot geographically in Africa, and then another spot, hundreds of, far away from that tribe. And within those tribes, you're getting interbreeding, intermarrying. Well, then we shouldn't have a single mitochondrial DNA ancestor. We should actually have multiple mitochondrial DNA lines because that would be multiple coalesced mitochondrial DNA sequences. And so the
Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan, yes, a lot of
So,
people
so my
today
point.
go
My
back to
point.
Genghis Khan, but we have
Yeah.
evidence for people before Genghis Khan because Genghis Khan would fall within this
Well,
Y
no,
chromosome tree.
I'm sorry. The that was kind of me just doing a quick quip. But the point I'm trying to illustrate by saying Genghis Khan is that also tying into intelligence, we forget a lot of the things that we are capable of and how the things that we as humans do can influence the things that happen. So, especially with our evolutionary line. So, I was going to make this clip actually earlier when you were talking about how there was very little variation, and I was going to joke in and just say Genghis Khan. And the point I was going to make there is that, you would expect there to be less variation than what you would normally consider mathematically. This is why I was arguing earlier against, you could say theoretically, if this is the math, but circumstantially that is not the case because we have things like people like Genghis Khan, people like Hitler, where we have genocides where a lot of people are killed. We kill each other, so we're affecting the variation just in the way that we do things in our own day-to-day lives. It's not just simply the case that yeah, like when I say environmental pressures, but it's more so just selection pressures in general, which ranges from things that we do to each other like that on large scales, wars where we're wiping out a large mass of population, to even simple things like how we choose our mate, which, as you said, what I'm saying, we're like in tribes, we choose people that are similar to us, which is going to limit the variation if we're choosing people that are similar to us.
But my problem is, how does that? And you're starting to be muffled again. I wonder if you plugged.
I did. I did.
And you probably have, no worries. You probably have no choice because it's probably dying soon. But we'll wrap this up soon. So my issue is, and we can further this discussion at a later date, is I don't think it answers the objection I had because, again, we have evidence for a single mitochondrial DNA ancestor that we've all descended from. But if evolution was true, that should not be true. We should find multiple mitochondrial DNA lines.
Well, the point that I was making to, again, why we may not necessarily find that is because of people like Genghis Khan. It could be the case that there was, but they got killed off. Something may have happened to them.
Carlos, let me ask Donnie something real quick. Donnie, can you clarify for us real quick two real important points? One, that the evolutionists also have a bottleneck in their proposed history. But if I'm not mistaken, if I'm mistaken on that, you can correct that. But I think they do. And if so, how long ago? And then point number two that Carlos is trying to make is irrelevant because Donnie, you can elucidate this, but the graph that you showed actually implies a clock, a genetic clock that predates Genghis Khan and any of the historic stuff that Carlos is talking about. So, in other words, all that historic stuff that he's throwing out there.
I wasn't specific. I'm not
completely
hyper
irrelevant.
focusing on Genghis Khan. I'm saying I was just referencing him because he's a well-known example, and we understand how his actions have implicated
But
things.
all the
So
historic
the point was that this could have happened plenty of times. You can look at how chimpanzees interact with each other. They go and they kill each other, take over each other's things. That affects how their diversity is going, because
But
they're
think about
literally
this.
destroying parts
Carlos,
of
look what you
the
have to believe.
population.
Carlos, it comes down to the law of parsimony. Look what you have to believe. Okay, so first I want to point this out. Yes, you can pick your haplogroup, right? You've got, again, your HVR haplogroup, most common in Europe, if I'm not mistaken. All of these branches representing DNA differences in people groups. This is basically random mutations over time in people groups. All of these branches do go back to a common ancestor. And so this person is the common ancestor to all of these. But again, we have worldwide representation. And so where you have common ancestors of people groups and haplogroups, they go back to other common ancestors. But the point is, every single haplogroup worldwide goes back to a single woman. In terms of Y chromosomal DNA, every single haplogroup, every single group goes back to a single man. And so with the evolutionist model, the problem you have is you have to believe, you want us to believe that, okay, in your out of Africa model, you have tribes spread out, okay, where you've got non-random mating. You don't have random mating. People are intermarrying and intermingling and inbreeding within their specific tribes. So you want us to believe that one specific tribe made it and every other tribe died off. And so their lineages are lost, right? Is that what you're saying? And then the one lineage that, that lucky woman, basically, she was able to pass on her DNA. And that's is that essentially what you're saying, is all the other tribes worldwide would have been killed off, but only one made it?
Not essentially. It's not essentially that it would be one made it. It's that whatever made it is left from all the ones that already died off. Like it's. It's not that hard. It's not that hard to fathom. I don't think it's that hard to fathom that tribes have engaged in warfare, killed each other, and then subjugated other members of other tribes, namely the women, and taken those bits of the tribes and essentially genetically just put them into the gene pool. They just interbred them, just bred them out. I don't think that's very far. That's very far fetched. I mean, we literally see it all the time.
That would diversify the tribe, because it's not the women that die, it's the men that die. In the mitochondrial DNA, you'd have a diversity of women.
Not necessarily, because if you're saying that after a certain point we're going to keep losing diversity, then if they just keep breeding in those populations, then it's just going to do as you said. They're just going to start losing diversity.
But remember,
at which point it wouldn't matter, because that diversity that's lost isn't relevant to whether or not we're reproducing.
I've studied genetics. It's not the women's mitochondrial that gets killed off. It's the Y chromosome that gets killed off.
Of course, because we kill the men.
Are you saying,
right,
Jungle, because the men who go to war and lead the way, they get killed off?
Yeah.
The women get left behind. It's harder to get a single mitochondria.
Well, not just they get left behind. So sometimes they go in there and they get taken.
And then they intermingle with the group that they get taken into.
Yeah.
And
they
then you
get taken into that, and it may start off with a lot of diversity, but then as you were saying, it would probably go down.
I think,
but at that point, it's just not it doesn't matter.
I think Donnie's whole point's very evident here, though. Carlos doesn't seem to understand the genetic implications of that scenario. Should be what we don't see is you should genetically be able to discern multiple mitochondrial lines existing at the same time.
I understand that, but what you're not seeing is what you're trying to wave off is the possibility that we have created a circumstance in our interactions where that is not possible for us to find just because of how we've destroyed evidence. We've
No, that's exactly
we've
the
nuked places, for God's
Yeah, but
sake.
That's
Carlos,
We've
exactly
nuked places. We've
Carlos,
caused
you can't go and say,
irrevocable damage to
that's the-
places that you know what I'm saying? Like
You haven't explained how though.
Yeah, that's
Carlos,
exactly
you
the
can't
point
go
you're
and
missing,
say,
Carlos.
I want to say this, Carlos, you can't then go and say when somebody presents, I'm just going to turn your mics.
yeah, I'm mute
No,
myself when I'm talking.
no, you're doing good. Just suddenly now it's really loud. I don't know why, but you can't really go around saying to the mitochondrial DNA data that suggests we've all descended from one woman. You can't just assert, oh, but that woman belonged to a population and she had previous ancestors. You've shown that, well, maybe this or maybe that, or perhaps this is the reason. I mean, this is not empirical. This is actually storytelling, and basic coalescent theory tells us that naturally we should find multiple mitochondrial DNA lines. But let's just say, for sake of argument, what you're saying is true. Okay. And this occurred somewhere between 70,000 and 200,000 years ago. Well, notice this again that I've shown on this tree. And then you can look at the data itself. Okay. Where we've got the Eve consensus sequence. It demonstrates that there's incredibly low, there it is, incredibly low variation. So if we've been evolving, adding mutations every generation to our genomes, mitochondrial DNA in terms of women, Y chromosome with men, then we should have far more than just, what does this paper say? On average, we only have 21 differences separating any two people. That's trivial. This data is what the biblical model would predict. One woman, one man, low variation. That's it. That's biblical expectations. But the evolutionists, they never predicted it. All they have in response are stories and rescue devices and a whole lot of post hoc, ad hoc rationalization.
Well, no, I would have to push back. My apologies. I would have to push back with sort of like an offshoot of how you guys tend to respond to us in terms of I often hear like Kalam arguments. I know nobody's bringing those up right now, but like so I would say you're assuming that there's no other people before her, and you can say that I have no position to assume there were. I would disagree on the basis that, again, we know people come from people. In the same way you guys would tend to say something can't come from nothing. I would tend to say people don't just come from nowhere. And you could say people come from God, but that's a separate thing you'd have to evidence. As far as we know, it's more likely to think of the two options that of these two options that she didn't have ancestors and she did have ancestors. It is more likely to say that she had ancestors because we know people have ancestors.
I would disagree with that because of basic coalescent theory, what we know about DNA variation, what we know about the mutation rates, and the fact that none of this was predicted from the evolutionary model. And if you want to believe, okay, we go back to previous ancestors and eventually we come to what? Our common ancestor with the chimpanzee, but we've already gone into the fact that, okay, let's compare them. Let's bring in the Y chromosome data from chimpanzees. Let's bring in chimpanzee mitochondrial DNA, and they're nothing alike. So everything points in terms of parsimony to the separate ancestry model. And I really encourage you, Carlos, and anybody else, look into that mitochondrial Eve consensus sequence paper. And you know what? You know who published that paper?
For sure, I'm gonna drop you my email, by the way, so you can send me again. I would really like a list. You can include this in a list of genetic topics you think I should look into, so I can get more engaged in these arguments from a genetic standpoint.
Well, instead
paper, of my typical just analysis.
No, this is good. Carlos, this has been good. This has been fun. You've really engaged with these highly technical arguments, and I do appreciate that. And so I really hope that you decide to join future open mics as we engage all the time. We bring people of different views into
I really appreciate you guys for having me.
Absolutely. So I hope you become a regular. I I think we're going to save any further discussion on genetic entropy for because we are doing another open mic next next Thursday on the 12th. So Carlos, hopefully you're free for that. You as well, TRock, and everybody else, gentlemen. I actually think this is the perfect place to wrap it up. I think if we get on another topic, we'll end up going for 10 hours. So everybody, it's been great. To everybody who's tuned in, thank you so much for tuning in. And stay tuned. We'll be back here on Saturday. To our critics and non-critics, this has been another successful night of Debate Dojo on SFT. God bless all.
Good night, guys.